The room smelled of old wood and new scandal. Vincenzo Moretti's cufflinks flashed under the courtroom lights like tiny coins tossed into a well. Then the twins cried it, two silvery screams that broke the carved air. "We want the cleaning lady!" Cameras jolted, the judge's gavel hovered above his desk like a slow-falling promise, and for a heartbeat, everyone in the high-security courthouse forgot how to breathe. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They had rehearsed everything about presence, how to tilt their heads when the press flashed, how to let a glance be a blade. Matteo and Livia Moretti had not rehearsed this, an ache lodged in the thinnest sound of their voices that turned a courtroom into a crucible. Livia's jaw was jawline stone, impeccably made up, but Matteo's hand twitched by his side as if he wanted to reach across rows of polished oak and press a palm flat against someone who did not belong to his blood. Vincenzo sat in the defendant's dock like a man whose life had been measured in margins and ledgers. He wore the same expression he wore when making peace deals, patent, practiced, ready to bargain. The prosecutor had just finished a show of evidence that painted the Moretti family's corporate empire as a lattice of shell companies, coerced contracts and extortion, routed through offshore accounts and encrypted marketplaces. The press called it the biggest corporate extortion ring the country had seen. The world called it the fall of a dynasty. Then the twins shouted for a cleaning lady. The phrase ricocheted through the marble like a confession. Reporters leaned forward, mics jostled, and the judge's eyebrows climbed in a silent question. For a network of terror that had been soothed by the family's old-world codes, oaths over wine, favors logged like ledgers, the notion that a woman who scrubbed toilets and emptied bins could hold the key to everything was both ludicrous and terrifying. Claire Santos was not in the room. She was 20 miles away in a neighborhood where the streetlights had seen better days, tying the knot on an apron that had long ago surrendered to stains. Her hands, capable of polishing brass until it shone like a coin, were more likely to be bruised than glossy. She had come to the city on promises she'd learned to dismantle, jobs that said stability and left her renting out rooms by the week, safe passage that was more traffic and less refuge. She had the neat, careful speech of someone trained to be invisible. She also had records, encrypted files that hum in the corner of an old laptop in the bottom drawer beneath a stack of unpaid bills. Files that smelled like a past she kept locked away. Whistleblower reports, forensic logs, the mapping of transactions that sliced through corporate veils and caught the Moretti Empire's name in a net. Nobody who counted the Morettis expected a cleaning lady to be a threat. They expected threats to come in tailored suits and quiet guns. That miscalculation was why Claire had hidden for so long, why the files were wrapped in layers of digital winterwear, and why she had taught Luca, the lanky hacker who lived 2 floors above her and smuggled her coffee in paper cups, to move like a ghost on a network. She had once worked as a cyber forensics analyst for a whistleblower NGO. Once, and then never again, because once leaves marks. At the sight of cameras turning toward the bench like a storm, Livia's eyes sharpened. She had always been the strategist. Numbers and faces moved the way a chess player's pieces did under her hands. She watched the public with the same cool patience she used to pit 2 rival CEOs against each other. Matteo, in contrast, carried the more dangerous intimacy of someone who had learned to protect by presence. He had that uncanny stillness that suggested he would do anything for people who mattered to him, a last resort savior who'd been raised on the scent of old cologne and handshakes that conveyed commitment rather than affection. For Claire, the noise of the courthouse would have been a background rumble of public life and public ruin if she had not been bitten by conscience one sleepless night and chosen to keep the files. It happened because one of the Moretti subsidiaries had bled a remote village dry in a deal that made the company plausible on paper and ravenous to those beneath it. Claire had seen numbers that read like small deaths and could not sweep them into neat corners. She had done what she always did, recorded, archived, encrypted, and then pretended the whole thing didn't exist. Then the prosecution had subpoenaed the company's servers, and the Morettis had panicked, and someone had remembered the cleaning rota. When the twins' shout echoed, the press room recoiled because it was an invitation to assume a domesticity that belied terror. Who goes to a trial and asks for a cleaner? The corridors rustled with the sound of whispered recalculations. The judge, a man who had spent his life translating law into rhythm, felt his courtroom pivot into something else, a theater of social power where even the word cleaning implies hierarchy. It was Livia who saw the leverage before anyone else. She knew how the world reads disadvantage as weakness. She was not wrong to suspect the power of the word. If Claire was not just a cleaner, If she was an analyst with files that could peel back decades of layering, then the family's entire infrastructure sat on a fault line. Livia's mind began to assemble contingencies like a machine: security sweeps, private subpoenas, threats disguised as offers. The Morettis did not beg, they bought or they broke. Outside the courthouse, campaign vans hummed and feeds updated like living things. The public wanted battle lines. The prosecution wanted a spectacle to prove the law could bite. Television analysts argued over the word empire. The twins, however, had turned the spectacle inward. They had called for Claire on a whim that was not a whim. Mateo had felt something shift when he heard her name in a phone conversation, a softness when she said his name once in the echoing stairwell where he had found her returning keys she had discovered in an empty office the week before. It had been a small kindness on his part to let her go about her work without more than a nod. He had not intended to care. He had not intended to let a woman who swept vacuums into the frame of his life. When someone finally located Claire, she was on a bus that smelled of fried bread and damp coats, a cheap radio buzzing in a pocket like a heartbeat. A public defender had been assigned to find witnesses and to reach the cleaning staff, and an intern with anxious freckles and a name tag went through the building's rota like a pilgrim. Claire answered the knock because she always answered knocks. She did not come because she believed in justice so much as because she believed in surviving the day. She arrived with a mop and a brown paper bag of lunch and a face that had learned to be small. She stood at the courthouse steps like someone who had nowhere private left to hide. Cameras found her in seconds. Her face was a pale coin of fatigue among the flash of 100 lenses. The press circled, and microphones bent down to hear the edges of her life. People said she looked nervous. She was. Not because of the Morettis. She had scrubbed their offices and had never been more than background static in their lives, but because once she had been trained to see how data hides wrongdoing. She knew what a file could do. She had seen men on the other side of the world lose everything because their names were encoded in a single word inside a spreadsheet. The files were not just numbers, they were lives she had sworn, quietly, stubbornly, to protect. Inside the courthouse, Mateo felt the world tilt the way weather tilts seasons. His siblings had wanted Claire called because Livia had wanted a witness to the family's compassion, a token of ordinary life to stand in the middle of extraordinary accusations. Mateo had not wanted the family tree pried open so publicly. He had not wanted Claire, who should have been a footnote in their ledger, to become a dagger in his chest. When Claire stepped into the light, the courtroom rearranged itself around a small woman in an apron. People leaned, as if proximity might tilt the truth in their favor. The prosecutor saw the chance for theater. The defense saw a threat. Cameras fed the image across screens worldwide, the cleaning lady at the center of a criminal dynasty's unraveling.
Claire's secret sat in her jacket like a pulse. She wore it as someone wears a second name, one that no one had officially given her. It was both a sanctuary and a sentence. The files could bring down the empire that had signed paychecks and given the city's skyline its backbone. They could also drag Claire into a war she had not asked for. She felt the appraisal of 10,000 strangers through glass and lens, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a private question. If I hand these over, what will happen to the people whose names are in the ledgers? If I keep them, how long until the family I have scrubbed for decides to scrub me from existence? The judge rapped his gavel when it seemed like anything could fall, lawyers rising and falling like tides, press corps murmuring. He asked Claire to step forward and be sworn. Her hands were steady, despite the tremor in her knees. Mateo watched her from across the room and felt the old rules of his life, taught by his father between cigars and contracts, begin to crack. His father's gaze, cool and implacable, did not shift. Vincenzo had always believed that the right combination of logic and brutality could keep an empire intact. A small woman with a mop had not been part of his calculus. As Claire raised her hand to be sworn, Luca appeared in the hallway, breathless and pale, a messenger on a skateboard with a hoodie clinging to his thin frame. He mouthed something at Mateo across the divided room, 3 syllables that should have been harmless, and Mateo's body went tense like a spring. The message was simple and terrible. Someone had been poking the dark in ways Claire might not be ready for. The first act of the trial closed not with a verdict, but with a dilemma that sat heavy as a bolt on the chest. Claire could hand over to cash and let the law tear the Moretti structure apart at the seams, possibly destroying livelihoods and throwing ordinary staff into chaos. Or she could refuse, keeping the knowledge to herself and living under the silent, ever-present threat of a family that had the means to erase what it could not control. Either choice was a ruin for someone. Mateo felt it like a challenge thrown at the family code.
Protecting the name was the oldest rule. Protecting a woman who refused to be another ledger entry was not. His loyalties cleaved in ways he had never permitted himself to imagine. To the world, he was the heir who would close ranks. Inside, he was a man who had watched Claire tidy more than marble. She had straightened a photo, returned a lost key, and in those tiny acts he had seen a humanity he had been conditioned to only order. The courtroom lights dimmed and refocused like a heartbeat steadying. Reporters promised a week of pundits and panels. The prosecution promised to subpoena every device Claire had touched. The Morettis convened behind closed doors with the smell of espresso and power.
Claire sat alone in an empty viewing gallery for a moment, the weight of her choices like a grain she could not swallow. Outside, the city breathed, indifferent, hungry, alive. The dilemma hardened. Hand over the files and watch the world she had come to know burn under the law's gleaming teeth, or hold them close and trust a fragile, dangerous tenderness in a man whose world was built on the illusion of unbreakable bonds. The twins' shout had started a cascade. The question now was whether Claire would be a tool in a public spectacle or the center of a reckoning neither the court nor the family had foreseen. The first question the press wanted answered was small and loud. Where had Claire Santos hidden the files? The second was quiet and enormous. Who would reach her first? The prosecutor circled like a shark picking at a fresh scent. His voice had the calm brightness of a man accustomed to spectacle. He wanted Claire's cash not just for evidence but as absolution, to show a public that the law could unmask even the most gilded crimes. Livia wanted the files too, but wrapped in silk and delivered like a favor. Payoffs, safe passages, quiet deletions. Vincenzo wanted them gone entirely, the way men wanted stains gone, aggressively, without conversation. Matteo wanted them hidden, but for reasons that surprised him with their rawness. He wanted Claire safe in the way one wants sunlight to be constant, simple, selfish, unearned. Lawyers in tasteful suits began to orbit Claire with forms that smelled of institutional calm. Offers were phrases buried in legalese, protections, relocation programs, witness security that seemed to promise a new life if only she would surrender her archive. An assistant from the prosecution, young, pale, with the nervous certainty that comes from being on the side of righteousness, spoke to her in the courthouse corridor, her voice a tremulous instrument trying to be kind. You could go into the program. You'll be safe. We'll take the files. People will be held accountable. Claire listened to the music of their promises the way a person might listen to a song that once belonged to someone else, familiar, achingly foreign. She had been trained to scrub away details, to remove the fingerprints of human failure from columns of memory, and now those same instincts screamed that handing over the files would turn them into instruments of someone else's narrative. The lives within those spreadsheets were more than column totals. They were taxes avoided, homes foreclosed, communities forced into silence. She had known, in the way that knowing sits like an ache beneath the ribs, that exposing the truth would not simply punish the guilty. It would ripple into the lives of the innocents she had spent her life trying to protect. The prosecuting team's programs were clean and necessary and blunt. Her conscience had given her the files because she could not let the world pretend harm didn't exist.
But conscience did not come with an instruction manual for how to protect the collateral lives caught in the crossfire. Matteo watched all of this with a pallid restraint that made him appear almost sculptural. He attended the conversations like someone who moves through a house he already owns, his presence marked, never intrusive, always positioned to take action when the choreography demanded it. He listened to the prosecutors, to the defense counsel, to Livia's clipped strategic suggestions, and to his father's soft admonitions about optics and precedent. He also watched Claire like a man trying to learn a language he had never been taught. He noticed the small things, the way she cradled the strap of her bag as if holding the world at its seam, the way her jaw tightened when someone asked about her past, the way her fingers left faint circles of residue on the courthouse bench as she sat. Those circles were more than physical. They were traces of a life held under pressure. That evening, a man with a name like a folded paper, Luca, knocked on Matteo's office window and mouthed a single fierce syllable. Compromised. Matteo let him in. Luca smelled like coffee and late nights. His hoodie bore the pocked evidence of soldering and too many caffeine-fueled hacking runs. He was lean, quick-jawed, the kind of person who hid certainty in speed. He told a story in bursts and images. Someone had found patterns,
A botnet had sweeps. An IP trail pointed, imprecisely, but enough, back to the apartment above the cleaners' union. Lucas said it with the bored cadence of someone used to disasters blooming into crises, but his eyes were hammered with an urgency Mateo couldn't ignore. They've pinged the router. Not just the courthouse, Milan nodes, Lisbon, New Jersey. They're scraping anything with a timestamp that matches the files. Claire's been narrowed down through metadata leakage. It's sloppy, Lucas said, but it's enough. Mateo's face did not change much, a man who had learned to translate danger into movement. Who's scraping? He asked. The answer arrived like a bullet in a crowded room. Not only prosecutors, there were private intelligence operatives circling, contracting shadow firms. There were rival families smelling blood. And worst, there was an internal purge committee within the Moretti apparatus who considered leaks an affront to lineage. In other words, Claire's life was a map with too many hands on it. He did a thing he almost never did. He thought aloud, and the sound surprised him. If they come for her, they'll come fast. The sentence was a taut wire between his chest and someone else's breath. We can help her disappear, legally, he added, which was a commitment partly to law and mostly to his own desire to protect. Luca gave him a look like a man who had just been handed a grenade with a slow fuse. You know what they do. You know what your name does. Yes, Mateo said.
He did not say he also knew what his body did, what a gentle touch did, how a brief hand on a wrist could reroute a woman's day. He kept those smaller truths to himself. For Claire, the threats arrived as a series of small, devastating intimations. A flat tire, an anonymous envelope with a photograph of her cleaning a conference table, a call meant for someone else with a voice that made cold promises about the cost of curiosity. Each incident brought a new weight. She had always believed fear arrived with fireworks and blackmail letters. Instead, it crept in, a slow seep that settled into the spaces she had left unoccupied. Her neighbors noticed. Luca noticed more than anyone. He took to replacing her router, changing passwords, building digital walls like awkward gifts. He was a friend in the way that someone tends a plant. He gave what he could and cursed the limits of what he could not. The prosecution's interest became public theater. They asked for Claire to make a statement on the record during an evidentiary hearing. The courtroom would be full. Cameras would not be kind. Claire agonized in private. In the small apartment she rented, she took down the files and stared at them like relics that might explode. Each document folded like a thin accusation. She had traced transactions, mapped shell corporations, recorded names. Each entry was a cut. They were not anonymous. They carried the faces of accountants, of community leaders who had signed papers because they had believed the promises, and of workers whose salaries had been siphoned into accounts abroad. Claire's ethical calculus was not simple. She was not naive enough to think exposing everything would be justice. She was, however, stubborn enough to believe that secrecy itself had a body. The first obstacle was simple. The prosecution wanted the cash, but it wanted it unredacted. The defense wanted it never. Claire wanted it to do the least harm. The faces around the table represented these truths, and none of them suited her like a coat. The court scheduled the hearing. The date sat in her brain like a stone. On the morning of the hearing, Mateo did something both defiant and fragile. He found her on the courthouse steps before the proceedings began. He looked like someone who had not slept in the way sleep is a surrender. He held a coat, a heavy, dark thing that smelled of someone who used to walk long distances in the rain, and offered it to her without the pretense of ceremony. She took it, and the gesture held 1,000 small meanings. It was a shield and an admission and an attempt at tenderness that had nothing to do with the family ledger. People will say I'm only protective because it's my family, he said, voice low enough that the microphones would not find him. Maybe they'll be right. Maybe they will, Claire said, and the coat slipped over her shoulders like a promise neither of them wanted to claim. Her hands were warm. His were not.
They stood that way, two silhouettes on an unexplained border, the kind between media glare and personal risk. Inside the courtroom, the air tightened. The judge's face had the patience of a man who believes law is a ladder out of chaos. The prosecutor spoke of duty. Livia sat with her hands folded, muscles controlled. Vincenzo reclined like a man who had been on both sides of too many tables. Claire's statement began haltingly. Then, like a stone finding a current, her words fell into a rhythm that made the room still. She began by telling the truth she could not avoid. She had worked in cyberforensics. She had archived files. She had seen the names. She spoke not like an avenger, but like someone giving account of a life lived in the margins. The court leaned in. The city leaned in. When the prosecutor asked about motives, Claire answered with a quiet honesty that made the judge's gavel feel unnecessary. "No one asked me to do anything grand," she said. I did it because numbers shouldn't be allowed to remove people's dignity. I did it because I thought, maybe selfishly, that if someone knew, something might change. The room registered the ache in her voice. It was not the theatrical confession the defense feared. It was plain. It was human. Reporters scribbled. Livia's face darkened. Vincenzo's jaw tightened. Matteo felt the world rearrange under his feet in a different way. Clara's admission was not a betrayal of anything he held dear. It was a revelation that the family's dominion could be measured by how many lives it touched. His father's empire suddenly had a shape Clara's files could trace. After the hearing, the small groups that formed in the corridors were less about law and more about strategy. The prosecution convened with outrage and a faith in institutional correction. Livia spoke with people who could offer exile disguised to security. Vincenzo spoke with men who had ways of making problems disappear. Matteo found Claire in the quiet of a windowed corridor, where the city looked like a landscape of possible futures, bright, dangerous, and not wholly his. "You did well in there," he said, the compliment clumsy because it carried the weight of someone attempting to be human in a space designed not to teach humanity. "You told the truth." "You told a different truth," Claire said. "You told your truth when you let me keep the coat." They both laughed, small and unexpected, the sound of two people discovering humor in the middle of an earthquake. For a breath, the courthouse became a private space again. But the tremors had not ended. The moment Claire had admitted ownership of the files, she had also become a living target in ways she had not anticipated. A journalist's post included a photograph of her name above a thread of comments that were mean, possessive, speculative. Livia's social networks flooded with articles about loyalty and betrayal.
People had already started to turn the narrative into theater with Claire as the instrument. Somewhere, likely in a room full of men who did not need to ask moral questions, a plan had been scaled to unmake what Claire represented. The first obstacle had been posed, and the second followed immediately. The world wanted an answer in the form of the files. The world, as it turned out, did not care about the collateral. The world cared about closure, a tidy conclusion that would fit into evening news slots. Claire's moral question, how to expose wrongdoing without exposing the innocents, would not be news-friendly. Matteo's desire, private, complicated, would not be admitted into headlines. And so the emotional push and pull intensified. Claire, the keeper of truth, feeling the gravitational pull of consequence. Matteo, a man shaped by violence and courtesy, balancing a dynasty's expectations against a soft, inconvenient feeling that had the audacity to be tender. Livia, whose strategies were sharp, watching both siblings with a wariness that bordered on predation. The city hummed around them, a machine of appetite and rumor. Outside, Luca rebuilt firewalls that felt like prayer. Inside, the Moretti hierarchy muttered and planned. In the center of it, Claire sat on a bench and held the coat Matteo had given her, the fabric warming under the weight of decisions she had to make. The files were a small history in her lap. They were not just data. They were a ledger of responsibility, and she could not tell, yet, whether responsibility demanded exposure or protection. The second act pulled them each toward their choices, a prosecutor with a hunger for proof, a family with the muscle to erase or to mend, a cleaner with a conscience that had the audacity to believe that people could be more than collateral. Each decision would ripple, each hesitation would cost. The first obstacle had become a maze. The exit was not clear. But one thing became simmeringly obvious. No one would be able to walk away unchanged. The next morning, the city felt smaller, its edges sharper, as if an announced scandal had carved away any illusions of warmth. Papers had headlines that sounded like verdicts. Social feeds argued ethics with the casual cruelty of people who only ever wanted to be entertained by other people's tragedies. Claire woke to the sound of a notification buzz and the acidic taste of dread. The emails were a thick, anonymous flood. Praise, vitriol, death wishes, pleas to turn over the files. Then, most dangerous, a photograph that showed the number on the landlord's bike shed where she kept an old thermal blanket and a spare kettle. She showed Luca the image as soon as he arrived, breathless and apologetic, fingers trailing dirt from the solder bench he claimed made his hands smell like the small wars he fought online. He swore, quietly, to bury her footprint deeper, to reroute metadata and fake GPS trails like smoke. He worked like a man whose hands had memorized the language of escape, yet when he spoke of tracing the leak, he kept choking on two syllables: internal. "They probed the courthouse feed before lunch yesterday," he said, voice rigid. "Someone took a clip, small, then amplified it into something else. Whoever clipped it added watermarks to force the metadata out. It looks like a pro job." "What does that mean?"
Claire asked. Fear had a grammar she did not like and knew how to conjugate. It means someone with access to channel flows, someone media adjacent, made your image viral on purpose. Whoever did it wanted you visible. Whoever did it wanted you to respond. Lucas' eyes flicked to the street as if the threat might be lurking in the pattern of late commuters. The word that landed on Claire's tongue was betrayal, but the shape of betrayal stretched. A prosecutor who wanted a star witness, a rival family that wanted a pretext to seize more territory, an inside faction who decided that the family code should be cleansed to save the rest. Claire thought of the squeak of the courthouse door, of the way Livia's jaw had tightened like a drawn blade, and the shape of possibilities congealed into unpleasant anatomy. Someone close had decided to weaponize her. She wondered, with the mild, horrid astonishment of someone who had never been the center of strategy, whether she had been moved like a pawn by parties who believed they could contain the consequences. The thought made her nauseous. She had meant to be careful. She had meant to hold the files like a prayer shawl, keeping them folded and warm. No one had asked her permission to become spectacle. In the Moretti compound, Vincenzo had redrawn the family lines with ruthless efficiency. He convened a council that smelled of louche d'espresso and ancient authority. Men sat with their faces made of ledger lines, and Livia presented contingency matrices with the smile of someone who believed in the arithmetic of survival. "We don't need heroes," Vincenzo said, the cigarette smoke in his words like a slow burn. "We need control. We own our stories, or someone else writes them." That pronouncement carried a subtext everyone there understood. Ownership required action that was not always, by the law of other people, pretty. Livia set charm against pressure, offers against silent threats. "We'll make it look like we cooperated," she said, fingers running along a stack of diplomatic proposals. "We'll hand over redacted documents. We'll propose an independent auditor from a firm with, how should I put this, lackluster teeth. Alternatively, we can make the files irrelevant." Matteo, who had watched from the doorway as this conversation cooled into strategy, felt something old and dangerous awaken, a compulsion to decide things with his hands rather than with charts. He had sat through his father's bargains and learned to temper his gut with numbers.
That evening, though, his restraint unraveled not into violence, but into confession. He found Claire alone on a rooftop that overlooked the city's sleeping glow. Luca had left to patch firewalls and phone contacts. Claire had come up to breathe. "You could hand the files to the prosecution," Matteo said, the sentence an offering and a question molded into one. He paced, shoulders hunched as if the city's weight rested there. "Tell them the context. Tell them the names you feel safe exposing." Claire looked at him the way someone might look at a person offering a knife with the sweetest of intentions. "And what of the families who will be ruined beyond the paddle of restitution? The janitors who will lose jobs because the company collapses into receivership? The low-level accountants who signed because they were promised payback?" The list in her voice was longer than patience. "There are walls here you don't get to knock over and then assume you can put back." "You think I don't know that?" Matteo's hands were sudden and compulsive as he gathered a cigarette from the corner of his mouth, an old habit, and then pinched it out between his knuckles, like a man trying to stop a small fire. "I grew up in a house full of the consequences of choices we didn't make alone. But I also grew up knowing what families are capable of when they feel betrayed. Do you understand how we smell a threat? Do you understand?" He stopped, because words were poor scaffolding for the thing that was really there. The raw, simple fact that he could not abide the idea of being the instrument of harm to someone whose small acts of care had lodged in him like a splinter. Claire's laugh was a small, incredulous thing. "You want to protect me because I folded your handkerchief once?" She did not mean it as dismissal. She was trying to find the granite of truth under the flaring human light. "You speak like you've never held a ledger that says lives equal profit." He stepped closer. "I've held a ledger. I've put names on it. I tore them out when I realized they had faces." She looked at him, not at the name Moretti, not at the position, but at the man beneath the position, a man who wore power like a uniform and tenderness like a mislaid medal. "You can offer me 100 different protections," she said. "You can promise I'll be in witness protection with a new name.
But you cannot promise the people whose names you don't want revealed won't be harmed in other ways by the collapse. His silence was a kind of answer. The chasm between their truths yawned wider with the sound of the city below. Ambulances, taxis, someone playing a trumpet down in the square. They were a pair who had stumbled into impossible intimacy and found that intimacy did not always equal agreement. That was a fracture too, a quiet kind that opens long after the loud explosions. Then came the hit that broke something concrete, instead of a rhetorical bridge.
Luca did not return from his last checkpoint. His apartment above Claire's was open, the door ajar, the smell of burnt coffee still fresh. On his kitchen table lay a small, cruel note, a terse missive that announced he'd been subpoenaed for unauthorized access and that his services were now subject to an investigation. There was a list of supposed infractions that read like a ledger of betrayal: unauthorized access to protected networks, tampering with evidence, obstruction. The list was carefully curated to throw suspicion at him and, by proximity, at Claire. When Matteo arrived, his face had the organized fury of a man whose only tool was decisive violence bent into lawful action. He lifted the torn rubber gloves on Luca's sink like a man lifting the evidence of an old life. Claire found Luca's laptop smashed and folded like a smashed insect. Someone had wanted it unusable, but they had not considered the ways a good hacker could back up a trail. "They'll take him first," Matteo said flatly. "They'll turn him into a story we can control. If Luca talks, they'll say it started with a cleaner and ended with a hobbyist. They'll build a chain and throw him on it." Claire felt ill. "Then he was our first mistake," she said. The words tasted like metal. She did not mean that Luca was disposable. She meant their lack of caution, her inability to see how many hands would reach for the ledger, had put people in danger. "It's not about mistakes," Matteo said. "It's about who's willing to admit them and who's willing to pay for them." "Pay in blood?" Claire asked, and the question hung there like a thrown coin caught midair. She had seen the way women in her neighborhood spoke of paying with bones, not dramatic, not public, but the slow, bone-tiring extraction of loss. Matteo did not have an answer to that. He had plans and payments and ways to move money. He had a car with licensed drivers and lawyers who smelled of civic absolution. But he did not have a way to convince a woman who had built her ethical bones around protecting small towns from corporate appetite that his empire would not take what it wanted to reconcile his conscience. Livia, in the meantime, made her own choices. She was not sentimental, and she did not believe in loyalty that cost the family its neck. At a late-night meeting with an emissary from a rival firm, an oily man with eyes like folded paper, she proposed a bargain so cold it seemed born of arithmetic rather than cruelty. "We'll create a story," she said. "We'll produce a sacrifice, a scapegoat within our companies who will accept blame, be stripped of title, and be made an example. The law will be satisfied, the public will be fed. The rest of our structure remains intact." The emissary smiled like someone who deals with carved meat. "And the cleaner?" "We'll arrange that she appears cooperative. She'll be placed in a program and made a hero of the commoner," Livia said. "If she resists, we'll make her the villain." People prefer clarity. When Vincenzo heard the plan, he nodded as if this was precisely the kind of transaction his life had been built upon. For him, nothing was tragic that had not been paid for in profit. And so the fracture widened, brother against sibling, human compassion against corporate calculus, messy moral truth pitted against the soothing algebra of public relations. Claire sat in the marauding center of these decisions and felt as if she had been carved into fragments. Luca's subpoena arrived in the mail with the finality of a verdict. He was hauled in by men who looked like accountants and moved in ways that smelled more like a raid than a legal process. Claire watched him taken and felt the cold rise like an ocean inside her. Matteo watched the same scene and clenched his hands until his knuckles showed white. He wanted to stop them. The family had means. He had means. Yet there was a legal color to the action that made intervention both dangerous and potentially combustible. He was at war with the idea that power could be wielded without cost to the people he cared about, and with the idea that some costs, like a name left unexposed, were simply intolerable. In the immediate fallout, Claire hardened in ways that frightened both her and Matteo. She stopped laughing the easy way she had the week prior. She began to answer with shorter sentences. The coat Matteo had given her lay folded on a chair, a small, lonely thing that smelled faintly of rain and of a man whose choices were drifting like leaves.
Where there had been small acts of intimacy, returning a found key, a shared joke, there now stood a canyon cut by the brutal, ordinary pressures of survival. She realized the foundation of her trust was built on the hope that Mateo's tenderness was not merely a problem-solving mode in a man trained to fix what he saw as broken. It could be that his kindness was a strategy, a way to manipulate the human heart to solve a problem with soft edges. Or it could be that he was genuinely, painfully, hard to admittedly, attracted to a version of righteousness that refused to be bought. The doubt ate like acid. It was the fracturing of romantic possibility into two shards: love as salvation, or love as another form of currency. Then came the leak that split the private from the public in a way that could not be reorganized. An investigative blogger, someone with a reputation for sensationalist exposés and little regard for nuance, published a list. It contained snippets of names and an unverified line that implicated Claire not just as a witness, but as a rogue actor who had allegedly manipulated files to make the Moretti family look worse. The post paired a photograph of Claire with Luca's name and a headline that smelled of accusation. It did not matter whether the list was true. It did not matter whether the facts could be disproved. The world moved on gut, and the gut said traitor. The social tide turned like a blade. Laughter became scorn. People who had once offered support distanced themselves. Mateo watched the way Claire's shoulders dropped, watched the way she folded into herself as if trying to hide from a rainstorm that never left. He also watched the way Livia's eyes glittered with a victory she did not bother to hide. "You could walk away," Mateo said one night, the words wrapped in the smoke of an exhausted hope. "We can create a new life." Claire looked at him in that moment not as if she didn't hear him, but as if she heard a version of him that might have existed in another world, one where his family was not a web of complicity, and his siblings were not competitors for a legacy defined by unassailable authority. "I didn't leave my old life to run to another that will let me be trophied," she said. "I came here to stand in the middle and tell the truth. I can't be your secret." His silence answered with the truth that would shape the next fracture. There are some loves that demand secrecy as currency, and some people for whom secrecy is a death sentence. The line between them would be the next place they would either build a bridge or watch it burn. The fractures were not dramatic, not yet. They were quiet splits, withheld information, a missed call that was never returned, the velvet distance and a look that meant, "I am handling this my way." The Moretti machinery continued to roll with elegant malice. The law continued to frame itself as the bathwater that would cleanse. And Claire, who had once thought cleanliness was about order, now learned the cruel truth that cleaning other people's messes often risks staining your own hands in indelible ways. In the press, in the corridors, in quiet rooms where men still spoke like judges despite not being on juries, alliances shifted. Friends became liabilities. Lovers became options to be priced. And Luca, in a holding cell beneath fluorescent lights, kept a thin smile on his face because he believed in backups and because people sometimes needed to be shown how fragile their loyalties were. He had left an indexed trail for Claire in the event of the worst, one last act of coded care that would reveal a truth no one had expected. It would change everything, if anyone had the courage to look. Luca's thin smile had been a hinge, not optimism exactly, but the knowledge that someone who knows how to bury truth also knows how to unearth it. Claire found the indexed trail that night in a folder named with Luca's terrible, private joke, Last Breath. It was a set of scripts and a key that would let her unburden the cache without handing over the raw names that would shred innocence. He had salted the files with redaction protocols that only she could authorize, and he had hidden instructions in the margins, written in the clumsy tenderness of someone who loved the wrong person's fight. She read the instructions until dawn.
They were blueprints for surgical exposure. Reveal the architecture, the shell companies, the linchpins of corruption. Shield the hourly workers, the clerks, the mothers who paid rent with their shifts. Luca had given her a way to do what her conscience demanded, unmake a monstrous structure, without letting the collateral become ruin. It was a miracle that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and late remorse. When she called Mateo, he answered on the second ring. The city was hollow with sleep. His voice sounded like a place someone had half built. "I can make it easier for you," he said. "I can make sure no one grabs you before you get it out." The sentence carried the weight of everything he could do, and beneath it, the single unspoken thing he was willing to trade: the family. Claire thought of Luca's battered router, the smashed laptop, the subpoena that wrapped around him like rope. She thought of the janitorial staff who would lose their jobs if a building's accounts folded into receivership. She thought of Vincenzo's ledger and the way a father's empire could crush more than his enemies. She also thought of Mateo's coat, the way his fingers had brushed hers, the small kindnesses that had become a map she could not unsee.
If we do this, she said, we'll need someone who can take the blame and shield the rest. The prosecution will want a star, and the public will want a fall. But I will not let innocents be turned into casualties of truth. Matteo's silence was the kind that makes a promise. When he spoke again, his voice had the hard, quiet quality of someone who had decided to call an end to a ledger by signing his name to it. Then I'll be the star, he said. She laughed, not from humor, but from the single vertical panic of two people trying to choose how to throw themselves at a machine without being ground into dust. You can't be my sacrificial lamb, she said. You're not a ledger item. I'm tired of being a ledger item, he replied. I want to be someone who chooses the people he saves. Let me be what I'm built to be, a problem made physical. What followed was less strategy than surrender. Matteo walked into the family's private room and unspooled a confession that stunned the old men who'd built their lives on a mission. He told Vincenzo he would alter tapes, fabricate a trail that made it look as if the leak had originated from within the company's internal IT team, a scapegoat on whom the law could focus. Livia, furious and precise, mapped how the cover could be shifted to look like corporate whistleblowing gone rogue. For a long hour, the Morettis discussed choreography, sacrifice as mitigation, scapegoat as salvation. Vincenzo, in the end, said nothing loud. He sat in silence long enough for the family to understand he knew the cost of what his son proposed.
He could not, with the old calm that had negotiated feuds over red wine and contracts, refuse his heir's desire to fix the shape of things with a thing more human than balance sheets. He folded his hands, and, with a father's math that had always converted love into liability, allowed the sacrifice to be arranged. Matteo's confession to the prosecution was a public unpeeling. He walked into a televised hearing and told a story he had kept secret, that he had manipulated logs and obscured metadata to protect a witness, Claire. He said he had believed, in a way his upbringing never condoned, that mercy could be operationalized. He admitted to authorizing redactions, to ordering an internal team to create a false trail implicating company IT. He said it in a voice that was flat and terrible, and contained the kind of guilt that reads like heroism in the wrong lexicon. The court gasped. Livia's face split into a look that was at once betrayed and calculating, and Vincenzo's jaw clenched like a closing safe. The prosecution, who had been angling for a clear villain and tidy absolution, found themselves with a different present, an heir willing to be punished to keep a cleaner out of the crossfire. The press spun the image into myth overnight, the heir who confessed, the family willing to fall to save a stranger. While Matteo sat under the bright lamps and made himself indictable, Claire moved through Luca's protocols with merciless calm. She uploaded the redacted cache into a secure server accessible to independent investigators, ones Luca had vetted by reputation and ethics, and, crucially, by distance from anyone who could be bought. The files were surgical revelations. Company structures collapsed into obvious fraud, shell entities were maimed, mechanisms of extortion were traced. The documents did not hang the small people by their names. Instead, they dismantled the scaffolding their oppressors had used. When the upload finished, Claire felt the world shift. The files went public in a cascade that tasted like rain after drought. The fallout was fierce and immediate. Indictments, resignations, audits. The Moretti empire cracked where it had been brittle for years. But Luca's redactions held. The janitor's hours stayed intact in the datasets. The clerks' livelihoods were, for the moment, protected by the exactitude of Luca's code. The cost, however, arrived in Matteo's cuffs. He was arrested on charges he himself had admitted to, tampering with corporate records, obstruction of an investigation. The image of a Moretti heir in handcuffs detonated across screens. Livia's eyes were knives, part fury, part relief that the family's name might be preserved by the fall of one man. Vincenzo watched his son being led away, and, for the first time in a civilization of ledgers, felt the strange gravity of paternal failure. In the holding area, Claire barged through the low cordon like a force someone else had let out of their cage.
She stood before Matteo with the sound of someone who had chosen a life and would not trade it for safety. He looked at her with the look of a man who had just bought peace with his own ruin. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, when the microphones were far enough away to let words be private. "You did," he answered. "You walked into a place I could not see without you guiding me." She reached for his hand, the action small and immediate and entirely human. The darts did not stop her. In a world precise enough to count the cost of a transaction, A touch is often all the proof one needs that someone still stands there.
"I won't be your secret," Claire said, her voice a thing that folded around his fingers like a bandage. "If people want to fall, let it be honest. Give them the name to hate. Give them the story that takes the blame. But do not make me out of pocket for your absolution." Matteo leaned his forehead against hers. "Then stand beside me," he said. "If I am going down, I want to know who is with me." She did not consider exile or flight then. She thought of Luca in a holding cell, of the janitors whose shifts were still safe because of the redactions, of the fissures she had opened into the city's heart. She thought of Matteo's confession as not merely a sacrifice, but a choice to become vulnerable in front of the world, an act that required faith in a humanity he had not been taught to trust. "I will," she said, "but not as your secret, as your consequence." They walked into the corridor together, the press a wave of hungry cameras, and the world waiting to decide whether their story would be mercy or spectacle. Vincenzo watched them pass and saw, in the silhouette of his son and the small woman at his side, a strange payment that had nothing to do with money, a reckoning made flesh. When Matteo was led away, Claire felt the scrape of his fingers against the palm on the metal. It was a small, ordinary thing, but it was the same cord that had guided her through kitchen doors, through nights of cold, and into this impossible center. In a world that had been built on secrets, they had chosen a noisy truth. One would bear the blame, one would hold the ledger open, and both would bear the cost together. Outside, the city made room for new stories to be told. Inside, in a cell that smelled of antiseptic and old promises, Matteo pressed his forehead against the cold of the bars and felt Claire's hand in his. It was not a tidy victory, and it would not erase the rot his family had sown, but it was a claim, a reclamation of humanity in the face of an empire built on erasure. Luca would be freed when his backups were acknowledged, the janitor's shifts would be audited and protected, the Moretti edifice would not collapse all at once, but would be dismantled by law and public outrage inch by painful inch. Livia would fight, of course. She was nothing if not relentless, but Matteo's fall had changed the arithmetic.
He had made the family pay a price that could be seen, and in doing so, he had turned a ledger into a story that might yet be rewritten. In the faint light of the holding cell, Claire laid her palm on the metal and lashed it to his in a gentle, defiant clasp. "We are not the same people we were," she said. "No," he replied. "We are something worse and something better. We are honest." They held on to that, and onto each other, as the world outside yawed and changed. The sacrifice had been made, redemption had been claimed, and love, complicated, unclean, and utterly human, had become the cost of truth. Days folded into a new rhythm that neither of them recognized nor rejected. The city, which had once been an auditorium for other people's cruelties, began to mutter different stories. Investigations that fanned into committees, audits that took weeks to eddy into policy. Luca walked out of custody thin and laughing a private laugh, public vindications stamped on his file like a second birth. He slunk back into his hood and his solder bench, looking smaller and bolder at once, and made Claire promise she would never let him be the only one who knew how to burn a trail. Livia did not fall as quickly as anyone hoped. She fought with the cold, economical ferocity of a strategist who had always believed people to be variables and outcomes to be optimized. She negotiated her way into a settlement that spared the family's remaining enterprises from immediate collapse, but cost her a grip on the family narrative. Vincenzo, who had kept his face an unreadable map for decades, found his authority hollowed by a son's confession and a daughter's deals. In private, he leaned on a truth that had never suited him well, that empires are built of people, and people are terrible at staying predictable. The Moretti name lost its impenetrability. It acquired a new taste in the mouth of the city, salt and iron, the flavor of reckoning. The courts did what courts do. They parsed culpability into counts and schedules, and the law set about its slow, deliberate machinery. Matteo's sentence was heavy enough to be consequence and light.